Hello everyone, welcome to part 1 of my 3-part Prado build elements series. The first element is air, or more specifically my onboard air system comprising of a TJM Pro Series Single compressor and a 1-gallon air tank mounted on the Kaon barrier shelf and the 4-way Tyre inflation deflation system. The main component of this build is the TJM Pro Series Single compressor. This is a 100% duty cycle compressor, as well as a 1-gallon or around 3.5 litre air tank and relevant air fittings. For all the main airline connections, I'm using this 8mm pneumatic tube together with the pneumatic push-in fittings to make it much easier to install. For the quick connect air outlet and compressor switch, I've decided to mount it on the left side of the Kaon barrier shelf by drilling 2 holes. Using a step bit, I drilled the perfect hole size to fit the bulkhead pneumatic push-in air fitting with the 1/4-inch BSP female thread that will be exposed outwards, allowing the Nitto female quick connect fitting to screw into. For the compressor switch, I've chosen to use a metal 16mm latching push button switch. It was a bit tricky to screw in the locking nut behind the lip of the shelf, but using a pair of long nose pliers, it was sufficiently tightened. The 1-gallon aluminium air tank comes with 2 3/8-inch NPT threaded connections, one on either end, and a 1/4-inch NPT in the middle. The NPT thread is mainly used in the US and Canada, while here in Australia the BSP thread is more common, so it's very important to buy fittings with the correct thread. For the ends, I use a 3/8 to 1/4-inch NPT adapter, which allowed me to then attach a 1/4-inch NPT thread push-in fitting for the 8mm pneumatic hose. For the middle outlet, I got a 1/4-inch NPT thread drain valve to allow me to easily drain any moisture that condensates in the tank over time. It's important to use a good sealant on all the threaded connections to ensure a tight seal. I'm using yellow Teflon tape for gas that is slightly thicker than the more common white type, and I just wrap it like 3 or 4 times around in a clockwise direction around the threads. The push-in connections already comes with a layer of the thread sealant, so it doesn't require additional sealant tape. The TJM compressor has many outlet ports. All the threads are BSP. I just needed to use 2 ports, a 1/8-inch port for the pressure switch and a 1/4-inch port for the push-in connection. I also needed to reorient the compressor so that the piston head lies horizontally rather than the default vertical position, otherwise it will not fit in the space between the shelf and the roof line. The air tank was mounted onto the shelf using the supply brackets. It was pushed flush against the cargo barrier and secured by bolting it directly to the 6mm holes in the shelf at 2 locations. I used some rubber strips between the bracket feet and the shelf to avoid any potential rattling. I also ensured that the drain valve was easily accessible. Before mounting the compressor, I have to sort out the wiring harness. As I'm not using the supplied TJM switch, I have to figure out how to wire it to my custom metal push button switch. The custom button has 5 pins and comes with a wiring harness with 5 different coloured wires. red and black for the LED positive and negative respectively, green for common, yellow for normally open, and white for normally closed. The white wire can be ignored as I will be using the yellow wire for normally open. This will connect with the green common wire or close the circuit when the button is pushed in or latched to the on state. With the LED, I also want it to turn on with the on state, so it's just a matter of joining the red wire to the yellow wire. Connectors also need to be crimped on for the green and black wires. I used a bit of heat shrink to neaten up the wiring harness for the switch. I used the continuity setting on my multimeter to do a quick check for making sure that everything is wired correctly. I then connected the custom switch wiring harness to the TJM supplied wiring harness. The TJM harness has an extra blue and white wire that I'm not using with my custom switch, as this is for the connecting to the dash lights and allows the TJM switch to be illuminated at night. This is a separate light to the on and off state of the switch. As my custom push button switch only has one light, it's not needed. I then taped everything neatly together. The TJM harness has a small gauge red wire as part of the switching circuit. This must be supplied with a 12 volt source and activates the relay when the switch is on. I crimped on a female blade terminal to the end to allow easier connection to the main power harness. You need to make your own power harness as this does not come supplied in the TJM kit. I'm using a red Anderson SB50 plug for the main power connection and 6mm size wire. This is equivalent to roughly 10 gauge wire as recommended in the TJM installation manual. On the positive side, you need to connect in line the supplied 40M MIDI fuse. I also connected a small gauge wire to the other side of the MIDI fuse. This will provide power to the switching circuit and will connect to the blade terminal that was crimped on earlier. I then use some braided sheathing with heat shrink at the ends to group all the wires together, and this completes the power harness. Before final installation of the compressor and wiring harness, it's a good idea to test it out to make sure everything works correctly. I've already ran a 6 BNS cable to the starter battery or alternator in the engine compartment. I have this cable tucked away in the left hand side 3rd row armrest and have it pulled out or retracted through a hole drilled into the cup holder. This will eventually plug into the DC-DC charger of my 12-volt system to charge a lithium iron phosphate battery setup that sits behind my upright fridge. Stay tuned for an upcoming build video of this setup. Since I'm also using a red Anderson plug here, the onboard air system can be directly connected to the starter battery. As it draws quite a bit of current when it's running, it's best to make sure that the engine is also running to allow the power to be delivered by the alternator. The supplied TJM wiring harness comes with a lot of extra wires for connecting air lockers that I'm not using, so it looks a bit messy. It would be much better or neater if I spent time making my own wiring harness to the exact length I need. And maybe I'll do this in future, but this works okay for me now. The compressor is mounted in its final position in the far back right corner of the shelf. I used the supplied backing plates and sandwiched it to the shelf with some rubber strips. All the excess wires were cable tied to the cargo barrier. It's also very important to make sure no wires is touching the piston head, as this gets very hot when the compressor is operating. Also check to make sure nothing is obstructing the air intake filter and there's good airflow around this area. The air tank takes roughly 25 seconds to completely fill, and the pressure switch will turn off the compressor when the pressure in the tank and the compressor reaches 120 psi. As part of my onboard air system, I made a 4-way Tyre inflation deflation hose set inspired by numerous videos on YouTube. The main difference with my setup is I'm using Nito fittings, which are more common here in Australia, and I used quick connects on the manifold to allow me to connect the hoses separately on each side. When the 4 tyres are connected and the bore valve is closed, the system will equalize and all the tyres will go to the same pressure. To deflate all 4 tyres at once is just a simple matter of releasing the bore valve. To inflate all 4 tyres at once, just connect it to the air outlet. When the desired pressure is reached, just make sure the bore valve is closed as you go around disconnecting all the connections. Be aware that the air tank will be charged full of air when you turn off the compressor. So to release the air from the air tank is just hook in a blowgun. Let's break down how I built the 4-way tyre inflate-deflate system. The air hose is a 50 foot or 15 meter roll of 1/4 inch Flexzilla Pro. The manifold is a 4-port unit comprising of 2 3/8 inch BSP ports and 2 1/4 inch BSP ports. Attached to one of the 1/4 inch BSP ports is a good quality air pressure gauge. I got a glycerine filled gauge as these are more accurate. Opposite the gauge on the other 1/4 inch BSP port will be a bore valve. Attached to the bore valve is a Nitto 1/4 inch high coupler male plug. I use genuine Nitto parts made in Japan by Nitto Koki. For the fittings that attaches onto the tyre valves or Schrader valves, I'm using the Haltech H5265 standard bore lock-on air chucks. These are not cheap, but locks onto the tyre valves more securely as it uses 3 prongs. Be aware that the Haltechs have NPT threads, so only fittings with the same thread type can be used. The 2 ends of the Flexzilla hose already comes with 1/4 inch NPT threaded connections, so all that's required is 2 1/4 inch NPT to Barb fittings. For the 2 3/8 inch BSP ports either side of the manifold, I attach a genuine Nitto socket. 2 1/4 inch Barb T's are used to branch out the airline, allowing 2 tyres to be connected on each line. For all the Barb connections to the hose, I use ear hose clamps to secure the hose. Measure and mark out the appropriate length of hose to allow connection to the front and rear tyres for the airline on each side of the car. For all the Barb connections, I find it easier to use a little bit of silicone lubricant to help insert the Barb into the tube. I then secure the hose onto the barb using ear clamps. I find using ear clamps gives a much better seal and less fiddling around compared to the more common screw type hose clamps. There's also less protrusions from the excess. A T-piece was used to split the airline and connect it to a short bit of hose to allow connection to 2 tyres per side. From the 15 meter or 50 foot air hose, I used around 6 meters, 20 foot, for the left and right lines to easily reach the front tyres from the boot. This leaves me with 3 meters or around 10 foot that I can use to make a short extension hose that's used to connect the manifold to the air outlet. So this completes my 4-way tyre inflation deflation system, comprising of a manifold, a short extension hose and 2 air lines that connect to the tyres on the left and right side of the vehicle. I hope you've enjoyed part 1 of my Prado Build Elements series. Having an onboard air system is essential to any 4-wheel drive doing any sort of off-roading. Stay tuned for part 2 where I discuss the second element, water.